The Middle East continues to occupy much of our attention. Gaddafi's compound may be in rebel hands, but fighting continues. In Syria, a famous cartoonist is beaten up as President al-Assad continues his crackdown, and violence of one kind or another continues in Gaza and Iraq. Soon there'll be another political development to throw into the melting pot. Welcome to Agenda with George Friedman. And that development will be the upcoming vote in the United Nations Assembly on whether to admit Palestine as an independent sovereign state. George, given the divisions amongst the Palestinians, how will this impact the region?
Well, it's a terrific problem. If the Palestine National Authority is admitted to the United Nations, essentially Fatah dominates that and is being challenged by Hamas. The United Nations vote will basically empower Fatah and will challenge Hamas. Hamas will find this a problem. It will find this strengthening its opposition. It will make its own alliance with Fatah more difficult. And Hamas, I suspect, is going to try in some ways to not so much undermine the vote, but to change the political realities surrounding the vote, both by placing Fatah on the defensive and, from its point of view, hopefully, placing Israel on the defensive.
That'll create a lot of problems for Israel, but also for Egypt.
Well, there are two things Hamas wants to achieve. First, from a strategic point of view, its basic problem is not Israel, it's Egypt. Egypt is the problem because Egypt, so long as it's hostile to Hamas's interests or only neutral, really prevents Hamas from developing. If Egypt were to become pro-Hamas, it would completely change Hamas's position vis-a-vis Israel, also change it vis-a-vis Fatah and the Palestinian National Authority. Therefore, it would very much like to influence events inside of Egypt to create a government that's favorable, to undermine the military regime that's in place right now, to end any sort of interdiction that's going on of Gaza. And so it would be interesting to do something to undermine in Egypt. One of the solutions for that is to create a crisis with Israel, a crisis that would compel Israel to act militarily, to re-enter Gaza, to carry out as aggressive a policy as can be made. Hamas would actually benefit in this sense. First, it would change the internal Egyptian dialogue away from the debate between secularists and the Muslim Brotherhood and the military toward the one thing that they all agree on, which is the dubious nature, I leave the military out of this, but dubious nature of its treaty with Israel. If it could stage round two of the uprising, if you will, then Hamas would be in a position to potentially install a government in Egypt that would be pro-Hamas. That would benefit it tremendously. Secondly, if that were to happen, its relationship to the Palestinian National Authority would change dramatically. And thirdly, the vote in the United Nations, if Israel were at that time engaged in combat operations in Gaza, would reshape the meaning of the vote. The vote would still happen, but it would be a vote that would be as much about empowering Hamas as about Fatah. And therefore, Hamas right now seems to have an interest in drawing Israel into conflict. We saw the attacks along the Eilat Highway, and in that attack, there's been a great deal of dispute as to who carried it out. But very frankly, I think it came out of Gaza, and it's very hard to believe that Hamas's intelligence organization, which is quite good in Gaza, didn't know that it was being planned. It's very hard to do anything like that without being known. And even was beyond the borders of Gaza, I suspect they would have known. They could have certainly stopped it. They're also firing a lot of rockets into Israel right now. Several hundred have landed there. Again, their claim is, well, it's not Hamas, it's another group or this group, but it's being fired from Gaza, and Hamas has control over that. But we can understand what it's trying to do. On the one hand, it's trying to entice Israel to combat. On the other hand, it wants to be in a position to deny that it was itself responsible for any of those things, and thereby paint Israel's response by attacking Hamas as both overreaction and unjust. Israel is doing everything it can not to be drawn into this, not to blame Hamas for this, to say it's not Hamas, not to create the situation where it has to, in the context of the September vote, be engaged in combat operations in Gaza. And oddly enough, Israel has an interest in not having this happen, and Hamas has an odd interest in making it happen.
We'll come back to Israel in a moment, because it's key, of course. But how strong will the current military regime in Egypt be in maintaining the status quo?
Well, the military clearly has maintained power and has a great deal of power. The question is, what does the military have to do to continue holding that position? So the opposition is divided, as I said, between two groups, secular and religious. In turn, each of these groups are divided among themselves. The opposition to the military is there, but it's very weak. It's very weak and incoherent and is unlikely to change the military's position. The question from an international point of view is whether or not the military, which clearly wants to maintain the peace treaty with Israel and doesn't want to get involved in conflicts at this time in any way, will find it necessary in the face of circumstances to either suspend or jettison the treaty in order to maintain its position. Right now, this is not something that the Egyptian military has to do, but there are those in the opposition and those in Hamas who would like to see that happen. And forcing the military to do that is something they want, and that's more important to some people than a shift in the government. In many senses, we have a very strong military government, and we expect that to stay there.
Another bit player in all this, if I can call them that, is Hezbollah, now in a tricky position because of what's happening in Syria.
Syria's Assad is clearly on the ropes. He has a very strong force supporting him, otherwise he would have fallen long ago. But there's a possibility that it would fall. Syria is one of Hezbollah's major supporters. Iran is another supporter, but Syria is much closer, and much of the support flows through Syria. So if Syria were to fall to a Sunni government, that Sunni government has other people to support in Lebanon aside from Hezbollah. Hezbollah obviously is very concerned with what's happening, not as nearly as much as Assad. And again, if we simply speculate here, Hezbollah might find that it's in its interests to engage in any conflict that might occur between Hamas and Israel on the northern frontier, both to re-energize its own position, but also perhaps to draw some of the venom from the opposition that's attacking Assad. I mean, one of the issues is that once there's conflict with Israel, Assad can make the claim that this is no time for this internal stuff. You've got to really deal with Israel. I mean, all of this is speculation. There's no evidence that, unlike with Hamas and the firing of rockets, there's no evidence that Hezbollah is preparing for immediate combat in this circumstance. But it's certainly something that, just speculatively, would be an interesting possibility for them.
Now, coming back to Israel, what are Israel's options? Because at some point they would be drawn back in if attacked.
There's a certain point at which the level of damage being caused in Israel by rockets, by terrorist attacks, something else, simply must be responded to for very rational reasons. And so the point here is Hamas engaged in this preliminary action in order to raise the stakes so high that Israel can't refuse combat? Is this simply a probe at Israel for reasons that are not altogether clear? And secondly, how much pain can Israel endure before it finds itself eager to respond? It really doesn't want a repeat of Operation Letcast of 2008. That ended very badly politically. It is with minimal military success, although it had some. It really doesn't want to do that again. And it's going to try to do everything it can to avoid it. But at a certain point, the decision for war or not war is not simply Israel's. It's the other side gets a vote. And it's very important to watch if Hamas's rocket fire increases dramatically and becomes more effective. At that point, Israel will have to do something.
Where do rich countries like Saudi Arabia that have funded the Palestinians stand on all this?
The Saudis really don't want this sort of instability right now. They've just gotten through the Bahrain crisis and other instabilities in their region. On the one hand, they don't want to do anything to strengthen Iran, and they wouldn't really mind Assad falling. On the other hand, they really don't want to create a situation where they're forced to come in and support, at least financially and rhetorically, Hamas in a war against Fatah. The Saudis right now are not looking for trouble. That really is pretty much Saudi Arabia's position, and frequently gives money in order to avoid trouble.
Finally, there's not much doubt about the outcome of this vote, is there? It's going to happen.
That seems to be certainly the case. The only question is by how much, and that's one of the reasons why the Israelis really don't want to go to war right now. They don't want to do anything to increase the margin.
George, thanks. George Friedman there, ending Agenda this week. Thanks for being with us. I'm Colin Chapman. Have a good weekend.